Hello. Hola. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Bienvení con una E slash también una arroba. All are invited for a reading from the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers. We continue with Chapter 26. Chapter 26 is titled E-Communities, How an HBCU Research Practice Partnerships, Community Cultural Wealth, Galvanized, Minoritized Students' Access to STEM Spaces. By Professor Deena Khalil, Howard University. By Professor Angel Miles Nash, Chapman University. By Professor Adrian Wayne Bruce, Howard University. By Professor Joanna Sanchez, Excelencia in Education. And by Professor Meredith Kier, Williams and Mary. Thanks to the professors, we continue with page 349. Chapter 26. Section Designing E-Communities. I invite you to kick back and relax. And we'll continue. Designing E-Communities. The review of the literature highlighted the empowering institutional, curricular, and instructional principles that HBCU educators have used to uplift and nurture post-secondary STEM students. To explore how an HBCU research practice partnership can possibly mimic these preparation principles. The remainder of this chapter describes how such a partnership brought together the professional knowledge and cultural resources of various stakeholders, including teacher, education, scholar, practitioners, science and mathematics teachers of color, STEM professionals of color, and minoritized learners. For more, we can see Khalil and Kier 2017, 2018, 2021, 2021 again, with Kier and Khalil 2018. Situated in the context of a federally funded partnership between an HBCU and the wealthiest per capita black majority district in the country. We first describe how e-communities stakeholders drew from principles of critical race design to disrupt inequitable STEM learning ecology epistemologically, methodologically, pedagogically, by iteratively designing opportunities that galvanize minoritized students' access to STEM concepts and practices. Cited from Khalil and Kier 2017, 2018, and 2021. Next, we introduce how community cultural wealth supported our exploration and contextualization of social and academic dimensions of cultural capital as pedagogical resources needed to navigate STEM spaces both in K through 12 and beyond. After a brief description of our conceptual framework that captures both design and implementation of e-communities, we turn to the thematic summary of stakeholders' cultural capital to illustrate the potential of a RPP's cultural capitals in addressing the complexity of disrupting social inequalities. It's cited from Solorzano and Yoso, 2002, Yoso, 2005. Below, we consider how these framings can serve as both theoretical resources as well as methodological practice. Aside from Mendoza and more in 2018. Next, subsection. Critical race design. At the structural level, we designed and carried out our RPPP, through an approach that follows critical race design, as cited from Khalil and Kier 2017 and 2018. Given the partnership takes place between an HBCU and a predominantly black community, critical race design draws from two well-established frameworks: critical race theory and education, as cited from Latson, Billings, and Tate, 2000. Latson, Billings, and Tate in 1995, and Yoso in 2005. And design-based implementation research. I cited from Penual and more in 2011. Conceptually and methodologically, critical race design relies on the tenets of critical race theory to interrogate how we, as a community of stakeholders, can iteratively disrupt and transform inequitable learning spaces through principles of design. By interrogating components of design-based implementation research. For example, community-based practice research, implementation research, participatory evaluation, and design-based research, as cited from Benoit and Moore in 2011. With tenets of critical race theory, for example, challenging race-neutral approaches, questioning interest convergence, and emphasizing experimental ways of knowing, as cited from Latson, Billings, and Tate in 1995. We initiated the following 3 guiding principles of critical race design in e-communities. A. Attending to the historicity of minoritized students by taking a race-conscious approach to recruiting community stakeholders who would serve as collaborators for developing equitable STEM learning ecologies. B. Iteratively redirecting and reconverging the interest of school stakeholders who are traditionally driven by a standardized, scripted curriculum to incorporate culturally specific practices and resources. And C. Empowering minoritized students by situating their everyday experiences and narratives as epistemological resources for solving culturally specific societal problems. As cited from Khalil and Kier, 2018. In critical race design, the preconcepts of critical race theory identify educational, community, and societal inequities, while the principles of design-based implementation research provide iterative design strategies for our RPP stakeholders to address those inequities. Continuing again from in critical race design, the preconcepts of critical race theory identify educational, community, and societal inequities, while the principles of design-based implementation research provide iterative design strategies for our research practice partnership stakeholders to address those inequities. Next, subsection, community cultural wealth. At the intermediate level, we focus on the ways critical race design principles promoted stakeholders' knowledge sharing systems through various cultural capitals that Yoso, 2005, collectively described as community cultural wealth. Also based on critical race theory, community cultural wealth counters dominant narratives that minoritized communities lack social and cultural capitals and situates these capitals as empowering forms of resistance that minimize the racial power disparities that promote exclusionary practices of minoritized communities. Cited from Guajardo and Moore in 2018, Yoso in 2005. Yoso outlined 6 forms of community cultural capital: aspirational, familial, linguistic, navigational, resistant, and social. Aspirational capital refers to one's ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real or perceived barriers. Familial capital denotes the cultural knowledge that carries a sense of community history, memory, and cultural intuition while encouraging a commitment to community well-being. Linguistic capital outlines the intellectual and social skills one attains through communicative expression in multiple languages and/or styles. Navigational capital indicates the skills of maneuvering through social institutions, such as those created without communities of color in mind. Resistant capital represents the knowledge and skills fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequality. Social capital signifies the network of people and community of resources that may provide instrumental and emotional support to navigate society's institutions. The enactment of stakeholders' capital in Black communities somewhat emulates the ways in which HBCUs purposefully design ways to nurture minoritized students' racial, ethnic, and cultural identities and support their psychosocial and academic achievement. Strength-focused STEM spaces. Critical race design fosters engagement among minoritized students by promoting formal learning spaces that center historically Black universities, researchers, and community stakeholders' community cultural wealth. Cited from Yoso in 2005. Thereby minimizing the power differential that may exist between research practice partnerships partners, cited from Guajardo and more in 2008. A goal of the e-communities research practice partnership was for STEM professional, university stakeholders, and teachers to design STEM instructional tasks that uplift students' cultural perspectives and social understandings, promoting the sharing of cultural resources. Although community cultural wealth speaks to the although community cultural wealth speaks to the medium of knowledge sharing. Yoso in 2005. It is students and teachers' access to various STEM concepts, practices, and pathways that is at the core of our HBCU research practice partnership. Thus, in this section, the domain-specific frame we pay homage to is how HBCUs empower post-secondary minoritized students' access to STEM, in hope of framing how e-communities sought similarly galvanized middle school minoritized communities' access into STEM spaces. Regarding aspirational capital, HBCUs have a long history of paving a way for minoritized students to see access to possibilities far beyond their current circumstances. Cited from Douglas, 2012. Preston and Palmer, 2018. For example, when compared with black students at predominantly white institutions, HBCU students tend to be more motivated to achieve their academic goals and accomplish their professional aspirations. Cited from Jackson and Nunn, 2003. Alcott and Skuas Cox, 2002. HBCU educators who diligently strive to create inclusive and nurturing environments that enhance student success and retention. Given the ethos of communalism shared between faculty and students. Preston and Palmer in 2018. Embody familial capital. For decades, HBCUs have created academic families centered on camaraderie and pride grounded in racial and cultural identities. For example, Frank Khalil Matson, Skates, and Autumns, 2018, found black pre-service teachers from HBCUs expressed a sense of kinship when their K-12 students found Black pre-service teachers from HBCUs expressed a sense of kinship with their K-12 students when describing how they engaged with them in mathematics tasks. By incorporating communal ways of knowing into teaching and learning contexts, minoritized educators engage students of color in ways that are indigenous to their everyday learning, as opposed to the colonizing practice we often see in schools. Hegemonic standardization that promotes the hierarchy of whiteness. Cited from Khalifa, Khalil, Marsh, and Halloran, 2019. HBCUs support their students' linguistic capital by emphasizing orality of learning contexts. More specifically, these institutions constantly communicate cultural relevance through their appreciation for multiple ways of expressing language, endorsing shared speech patterns, and validating Black cultural identities and realities. Cited from Dune in 2013, Du Bois in 2003, Garcia and Wise 2014. Both locally and across the diaspora. Cited from Alm and Moore in 2016. The open expressiveness, in turn, allows teachers and students alike to learn from one another while creating a supportive and cooperative learning environment. Cited from Hand and Moore in 2012. By demonstrating appreciation of oral modes of communication and respecting the vibrancy of which minoritized students express themselves verbally. A core cultural ethos of communities of color that Boykin and Moore in 2015 termed, quote, orality, unquote. Teachers can counter hegemonic narratives by positioning personal narratives of their students as epistemological resources. Cited from Khalil and Kier in 2018. Orality, which stems from a legacy of transmitting information from older to younger generations of African tribe members. Cited from Belgrave and Allison, 2013. Includes practices such as call and response. For example, continuous transactional dialogue between at least two people. Williams, 2015. Spoken word. For example, speaking lyrics, poetry, or stories rather than singing them. Cited from Biggs L. 2012. And code switching. For example, modifying one's vocabulary or shifting pitch, volume, rhythm, stress of tone, stress or tone to better accommodate the listeners or conform to perceived participant roles and relative power structures. As cited from Belton 2016, Delpit, and Dowdy 2012, Hill 2009. Navigational capital is operationalized in HBCUs when faculty personally engage with students, instilling a sense of institutional pride and providing them with proper tools to succeed. As cited from Palmer and Gaspin 2008. Mentorship that is characterized by imparting personalized guidance, actively supporting students, and demonstrating a higher level of confidence in students' abilities, illustrates some of the ways HBCUs practice navigational capital. Cited from Lau 2016, Preston and Palmer 2018. Historically, HBCUs have sought to position, prepare, and empower Black students to succeed not only by promoting educational attainment and advancement, but also by providing a safe space in what many perceive as a radically demoralizing society. Cited from McGee in 2015, Palmer and Moore in 2011, Preston and Palmer in 2018, Ward in 1996. As, quote, sites of resistance, unquote, HBCUs support students' resistant capital and model oppositional ways to challenge the many inequalities they face when they graduate. As cited from Douglas in 2012, page 391. The reputation of Black intellectual and professionals among HBCU alumni, faculty, and staff serves as one of the most significant types of social capital for Black students, and is rife through the dedicated faculty, compository curricula, and alumni leaders in professional arenas and society at large. Cited from Brown and Davis, 2001, Lutt, 2018, Palmer and Gassman, 2018. And pause. While e-communities was critically designed in challenge, while e-communities was critically designed to challenge several systemic barriers to inequitable teaching and learning, there was a deliberate emphasis on positioning stakeholders' capitals to necessary resources for developing an asset-based approach to designing and implementing curricular resources. Cited from Boykin in 1983, Coleman and Moore in 2016. That improve students' access to STEM education, such as culturally specific engineering design tasks. Cited from Kier and Khalil in 2018. The cultural capital shared by stakeholders served as a conduit through which awareness of and engagement in STEM activities strengthen mathematics and science teachers and learning. Again, the cultural capital shared by stakeholders served as a conduit through which awareness of and engagement in STEM activities strengthen mathematics and science teaching and learning. Cited from Nasser and Royston, 2013. By teaching students in ways that privileged their cultural capital, formal math and science texts became more specifically relevant and meaningful to their lives. For example, Black teacher candidates and K-12 teachers expressed that a sense of kinship with their minoritized students. A process referred to as other mothering or other fathering helped them cultivate caring environments for students so that they could take mathematical risks while being protected from principles and practices that reify the false notion of Black student inferiority in mathematics, as cited from Frank and Moore in 2018. Subsequently, students were more likely to enjoy what they are learning and demonstrate interest and intrinsic motivation by being engaged with the learning and with the learning activities. As cited from Anali and Anali in 2011, Boykin and Nogar in 2011, Crumpton and Gregory in 2011, Leonard and Moore in 2010. Researchers have explained that engagement with academic content may happen because the shared cultural capital among teachers, students, and other educational stakeholders supports a degree of commonality between the formal learning context and the habitus of stakeholders that makes learning more likely to occur. aside from Gates and Gordson in 2009, Norris and Royston, 2013. Minoritized learners, adult or school-aged, then have a greater possibility of engaging with mathematical and scientific content, as it closely aligns with their cultural understandings and lived experiences. Cited from Boller in 2002, Dixon and Cologne 2016, Dominguez in 2011, Gates and Jordison 2009, Lipka and Moore in 2005, McGee in 2013, Setati 2008. Connecting STEM learning opportunities to community cultural wealth allows teachers to honor productive STEM learning so that social arrangements in the learning environment may cultivate kinship and solidarity among minoritized students and their school community. Cited from Saladon, Pachitis, and more in 2007, Gutstein and more in 2005, Hand and more in 2012. Such learning environments resentment of the village pedagogy of HBCUs, aside from Harris in 2012, have also reinforced students' abilities to resist inequalities while empowering them to pursue STEM interests despite encountering micro and macro racism in the school context. Cited from Frank and Moore in 2018, Gregson in 2011, McGee in 2013, 2015, Solins in 2010, Tolson in 2008. Although several researchers have described the role of these capitals, at times termed assets, aside from Lau and Moore in 2016, or ethos, aside from Coleman and Moore in 2016. In supporting minoritized students' learning, few researchers have empirically described the role of HBCU's community cultural wealth can play in developing minoritized students' STEM pathways. Most recently, the work done by Preston and Palmer in 2018 provided one of the best comprehensive conceptual explanations for how HBCUs nourish their post-secondary students' community cultural wealth. With this chapter, we seek to extend the research conducted by Preston and Palmer and address the overall gap in the literature by empirically illustrating how HBCU inspired preparation philosophies in a research practice partnership can transform exclusionary STEM spaces into meaningful and relevant opportunities. We're pausing here. Okay. Thank you for joining me for this reading from the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers. this has been from chapter 26. Chapter 26, E-Communities. How an HBCU research practice partnerships community cultural wealth galvanize minoritized students' access to STEM spaces. By Deena Khalil at Howard University. Again, by Professor Deena Khalil at I'm sorry, excuse me. By Professor Deena Khalil, Howard University. By Professor Angel Miles Nash at Chapman University. By Professor Adrian Wayne Bruce at Howard University. And by Professor Joanna Sanchez at Excelencia in Education. And by Professor Meredith Kier at William and Mary. Thank you, professors, for chapter 26. Thanks to you, we can continue looking forward to more from your chapter. This was the section designing e-communities with the subsections critical race design, community cultural wealth, strength-focused STEM spaces, and these subsections make designing e-communities. Next, we can look forward to the next section. On page 352, drumroll. Next time, we can look forward to the section from chapter 26, Methodology, on page 352 of the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers. Until then, I wish you a good day.